Okay, so one other possibility that we're going to look at is we're going to do this spending stimulus of $1,000, but if I didn't mention otherwise, then I assumed that I wasn't raising taxes in order to do that. So we're really assuming that let's say the government was doing it, you were borrowing $1,000 and then spending, or it was just one of those consumption just goes up by 1,000, just one of those spending components going up, in which case we're not talking about taxes. But suppose that the government wants to spend $1,000, but instead of borrowing, it's going to raise taxes by 1,000. So in other words, keep the budget balanced, right? Because if I spent $1,000 and borrowed, I'd be moving towards a budget deficit. But if I finance it through taxes, then I'm not having any effect on the budget. So depending on where I started from, if I started from zero budget, then I'm maintaining a balanced budget, or whatever budget I started from, we're just maintaining that budget. So we would call this a balanced budget multiplier, because I'm doing this stimulus but I'm doing it through raising taxes. And I could also do it the other way. I should mention I did it the positive stimulus over here, but we could also cut spending and it would just go in reverse. So if I reduce spending, well, then that reduces people's income, and then they have less to spend, and then someone else's income gets reduced and they have less to spend. So just the whole thing would just be negative instead of positive. So a cut in spending of 1,000 gives you a multiplier of -5, so I would be losing a total of $5,000 in spending. And the same thing over here. If I were to raise taxes by 1,000, then I end up with a negative amount here, a multiplier of 4, but it would be negative. Because again, if I'm reducing people's income, then I reduce spending, then I reduce more income, and then the whole thing goes into reverse. So if we're talking about balanced budget, we could also do it the contractionary way of reducing spending and then cutting taxes. But because of what we just saw with the spending and tax multiplier, the spending has a bigger effect than the taxes. So in this case, the spending has a stimulus effect. It's going to give me a positive multiplier. The tax is going to give me a contractionary effect. It's going to be a negative multiplier. But spending has a direct effect. The taxes has an indirect effect. So that's why this isn't just going to cancel out. The spending, given these assumptions that we're using, is going to have a bigger effect than the tax change. So the spending multiplier is this. And so in this case, that's a positive effect. Since I'm raising taxes, that's having a negative effect. So this is a negative tax multiplier in this case. And so if you combine these terms, then you get 1 minus MPC over 1 minus MPC is equal to 1. So the balanced budget multiplier, if you combine these two terms, it's always going to be 1. And the same thing, if I'd made this negative and this positive, then I would still get 1. So balanced budget multiplier always 1, which means that there's still a stimulus. So this doesn't just cancel out. So if I do this spending of 1,000 and raise taxes by 1,000, I'm still going to increase total GDP by 1,000. I'm just not getting the multiplier effect that I get over here. So here I spend, I get the multiplier effect. I cut taxes, I get this smaller multiplier effect. Here I'm still going to get this stimulus. It's still going to increase total GDP or total spending by 1,000. I'm just not getting a multiplier effect of that, because I'm kind of canceling out the multiplier effect by raising the taxes, but I'm not canceling it completely. Otherwise this would be 0 if it just canceled out. But since it's 1, the net effect is going to be you get that $1,000 increase in spending, you're just not getting that multiplier effect. So let me just mention one more thing. You might sometimes see the aggregate demand graph looking something like this, where you get this flat portion of your short run aggregate supply curve, you get this intermediate portion, which is normally what we're looking at, this upward sloping part, and then it just keeps getting steeper and steeper. Eventually it's going to go vertical over here. And so this kind of illustrates the assumption that we're really making with the multiplier. So you might see in the beginning of the section in the book that talks about this, and it says in order for to get the full multiplier, you're really assuming that when spending increases, you're just getting higher output and you're not getting higher prices. So you're really assuming that the curve is flat like this. So for a certain increase in spending, so this increase in the aggregate demand curve is a certain increase in spending, and then all of it showing up as higher output. So that's really what the assumption that makes this multiplier work, at least the full multiplier. And you can see that if you start to do it on an upward sloping curve, for the same shift to the right, you're going to get a smaller output increase, because now some of that spending is showing up as higher prices rather than just higher output. So you're not actually getting the full multiplier in that case. Now, whenever we're doing multiplier calculations, we're just going to assume the full multiplier holds, because otherwise we'd have to know by how much we're reducing that multiplier effect. So if we're given, MPC and figuring out the multiplier, we're just going to assume that the assumption holds here. Now, normally we just draw that upward sloping part when we're drawing these graphs, so we're not actually assuming the full multiplier. And then you can see, if I were just keep increasing spending, well, at some point I'm just hitting the absolute maximum capacity of my economy, and I can't just keep increased spending forever and expect to produce more output. So eventually, even though I'm already past the long run, but I might be able to do that temporarily. But eventually, there's just an absolute maximum capacity, and all you're going to get is higher prices if you keep increasing spending. So the multiplier is not exactly a free lunch especially when you're getting to these kind of levels here. You're just going to get higher prices. One other thing I'd mention, so one assumption that we're making to get that full multiplier is there's not anything leaking out of that whole series of spending. And if there are taxes, for example, that go up with your income, which is the way that our tax system works, is that it's based on income, at least income taxes are. And so these are called automatic stabilizers, because if income were to go up, let's say I'm over here somewhere, and so if income goes up, spending goes up, then you're getting bumped up into higher tax brackets. Your incomes are going up, and so people are paying more in taxes. So it's kind of like taxes are automatically going up during any expansion. So it's automatic because it's going to tend to prevent whichever direction you're going from being as large as it otherwise would be. So any expansion is going to be smaller than it otherwise would be. So it's kind of stabilizing any change in aggregate demand. On the upside, people end up paying more taxes when their income goes up. If you get, let's say you're getting pushed into recession here, well, on the downside, people's incomes are going down, which means you're paying less in taxes. And so it kind of gives you a little bit of a cushion than you otherwise would have, and so that's why they're considered automatic stabilizers. Any downside change in spending is not going to be as large. Any upside change in spending is not going to be as large, as long as you have taxes that are based on income. So that'd be one example of an automatic stabilizer. Another one would be like unemployment insurance, things like that. So anything that might affect your disposable income on the upside or the downside is going to change that whole multiplier process, because remember, in this process we just care about the spending change. And so if you're taking some of my income in the form of taxes, then it's going to the government. We're not worried about what happens at that point. But if there's less spending that I have, less income that I have available for spending, less spending, and that whole multiplier process is going to be a little bit smaller. So to get that full multiplier, really assuming, lump sum taxes, for example, that don't depend on income, and you're assuming that you have a short and aggregate supply curve that looks like this, so that none of it is showing up as higher prices.